Hello, everyone, and welcome a little bit later than planned to Inclusive Design 24 2020. We bring this to you with enormous thanks to our Platinum supporters, Barclays Access and Adobe. We have 24 live talks coming at you over the next 24 hours. And if the pixies of technology start playing a little more friendly a game with us, we should be all good. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and we ask everyone, no matter how from where you're participating, to look at our code of conduct that you can find from inclusivedesign24.org. You can follow all the action live through our Twitter account at ID24Conf. And if you want to get involved in the discussion, or if you have questions for our presenters, just use the ID24 hashtag. Without any further words from myself, I'm really delighted to introduce the first of our speakers, Claudio Luis Vera, who is going to be giving a really fascinating talk. They used to speak sign language. Claudio.
Great. Give me just 1 second to get my screen sharing with you folks, and we should be good. Can you guys see my video on screen? Hopefully so. Okay, well, thank you guys very much, everyone. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, and I'll try to see if I can't, keep us all on schedule, more or less. But tonight is great because I get to share with you guys one of my favorite stories in accessibility. There's lots of sort of historical sort of events that we talk about, when we speak about accessibility. But this one for me is very special. I lived in Massachusetts for many years. But it's also even more special because it's probably one of the most inclusive sort of situations or episodes that you would find in American history. And it went on for about 300 years. And this is where people in a certain part of Martha's Vineyard learned to speak sign language, and the entire population spoke sign language. So let me introduce myself very quickly. I'm an accessibility professional. I work with Royal Caribbean, the cruise line, and I specialize in all kinds of digital accessibility. But really, I'd like to pay tribute to Dr. Nora Gross. She's from Massachusetts as well, but she's in London, and she is an amazing anthropologist and disability advocate. And most of what I'm going to be presenting tonight is based on her book by the same title as this presentation, Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language. It is far and away the best piece of research on this particular subject. There's been a number of articles and blog posts and stuff speaking about this episode that are out there. Most of them is one point or another get their facts wrong, but I would consider her work, her book on sign language in Martha's Vineyard to be absolutely the definitive work when it comes to this. One of the things, a couple things I want to get out of the way. One, personally, I grew up speaking many languages. Sign language, unfortunately, was not one of them. And I do want to issue kind of like a trigger warning here that we're going to have testimonials and historical quotes, and the language that's that is in those quotes is certainly not up to 21st century standards. But I chose to include it that way because it really kind of came from how these people viewed sign language, and I felt that it was important to keep it in its original form. So let's talk about different ways that people look at disability and kind of give you a background. For those of you who are new to accessibility and have never heard of this, the medical model is really the way probably most of us until very recently looked at disability. It's a medical condition, it's treated through medication and therapy, and maybe you can add a layer of assistive technology on top of that to improve the quality of your life. But really, it's kind of like, once you go beyond that, that's it. So this gentleman, for instance, here is an American Civil War veteran, and he's in a wheelchair, but in his day and age, that was about as much assistive technology as he had. So his ability to participate in life in 1865 America was probably very severely limited. But that was considered part of his disability. Now, if we look at, for instance, another way, another sort of perspective, we could look at it from the perspective of the social model. Really, the disability is not the physical impairment. The disability is actually the ability of the person to integrate and participate in society. And so the problem then becomes not the impairment, but whether or not society is set up in such a way, or the system is set up in such a way to be able to accept these citizens with disabilities and have them participate fully. So kind of the corollary to this is that we create and we perpetuate our own disabilities. So there's a cartoon here. For those of you who can't see, there's a cartoon here where there's a square character that says you're going to have to change to fit into the system, and there's a square hole. And there's all these circles waiting to go through saying, or how about you change the system so we all can fit? So there it is, where essentially, like, if you can tweak the system in such a way to allow everyone to fit in somehow, then essentially the disability and the problems of the disability go away. And this is exactly what tonight is about. This is exactly what this whole talk about sign language in Chilmark is about. Essentially, it's that the entire population spoke sign language. So that was like the ultimate accommodation for people who were deaf. So let's give a little bit of background of what the journey was like that got us to Chilmark. So let's start our journey in England. And we're going to start our journey in the southeast corner of England in a section of Kent called the Weald. And the Weald was, back then, we're talking like 1600, very forested, lots of isolated villages, terrible roads. So essentially you lived in your village in the woods, and you would go through your entire life and really not get particularly far from the village that you were born in. And I almost kind of think of this as the Shire, you know, in Lord of the Rings. So someone could spend their entire life basically within walking distance of their ancestors' graves. So you could live in one village, in one parish, maybe go to the neighboring villages, and that would be probably about as far as you would get. The other thing is that you wouldn't marry, really. If you looked for a partner to marry, you wouldn't look further than the next village. So what ended up happening is that almost, you know, everybody there would marry into the surrounding villages and so on and so forth. So from a point of view of genetics, you wouldn't have like total inbreeding, but you would have this sort of gradient, you know, where if you're 4 villages away, well, you are 4 levels away genetically from the people in the original village. So this starts playing out because you start running into these sort of recessive genes for deafness. And deafness was actually prevalent in Kent, although in the year 1600, there really weren't a whole lot of records for this. So what Nora Gross found, you know, she went to Kent, she started looking at the birth records, started looking for, you know, signs of deaf people there. And she started finding that, but later on than the time period that we're talking about. The other thing is that there's a difference also in social class. So you would find the records that would be really good for people of upper classes, but commoners, you wouldn't necessarily find that. So what you also start finding is maybe a couple indications of people who were hearing also using sign language. So there's kind of a precedent that's happening there. And the sign language that they used is referred to as like an Old Kentish sign language. And I don't know if it survived at all in Britain, but it was eventually replaced by British Sign Language. So one form of sign language died out, and another more formal, more broader used sign language kind of came in to take its place. So let's talk about maybe the year 1630. Okay, we're in Kent, we're in the Weald, and they have a king, Charles I, who's extremely unpopular. He's an autocrat. He doesn't believe in the norms of constitutional monarchy. He decides to kind of go impulsively on his own. He doesn't care about what Parliament thinks. He has a very arbitrary sort of notion of the law. Coming from 2020, I think anybody would probably find that sort of thing familiar. And you have these group of people that live in the Weald. They're isolated, but they start feeling that the king is corrupt. He's corrupted the Church of England, and the church is so corrupt that they need to separate themselves from that church. They also, the way they refer to themselves are the godly, or maybe as saints, or maybe as God's children. But in this sort of notion, you've got a lot of the same sort of political dissatisfaction that you'd see now in 2020. And you see people wanting to break away or leave from this, almost as, as if some of us felt probably when the election didn't quite go our way. So on top of that, we have the financial hardship that a lot of these folks in these towns were weavers, or they were in the cloth trade. And right around 1630, you have a couple collapses within the economy for the cloth trade. So not only do they have a sucky king that they can't stand, they finding that the economy is not going their way, their livelihood is totally affected, and they start thinking, well, what's the next step? Well, the next step for them was, let's just leave, let's emigrate, So in 1634, 200 of them decided to get on the ships Hercules and Griffin. They followed their pastors and essentially, as a community, picked up and left the towns, the very small villages that there were in the Weald, and got on these ships and kind of did the journey across to the Americas to find a place that was as close as possible in terms of geology and in terms of climate and stuff to where they came from. And they were part of a mass migration of about 21,000. And these people in the States, we refer to them as the Puritans, but they called themselves God's children. I mean, they didn't think of themselves as Puritans. Puritans was kind of like this unflattering sort of label that they were given by others. So they landed in the town of Scituate. And here I have a map of Scituate up on the right. And if you can zoom in a little bit on your end into this pink square that you have, you'll see this shows the map, and it shows all the different properties that are there. And the property that we want to focus on belongs to a certain Bernard Lombard. And remember, this is 1634, spellings kind of go all over the place. So the spelling, Lombard could be Lumpert, it could be Lampert, it could be Lambert, but it's essentially the same exact name. So these people came over to Massachusetts, and they became known as the Men of Kent. And so if you were to go to Scituate, Massachusetts now, you would actually find a Men of Kent cemetery where most of the people, from this original wave of colonization are buried. So let's do some quick geography here. Let me point out where these different places are in Massachusetts. So we have Boston way up here. I don't know if you can see my pointer. It's up towards the top where there's a little bay. And then to the southeast of that, you'll see Scituate. And Scituate is the first stop for the pilgrims that we're watching. And then from there, we have Barnstable or Bonstable in Cape Cod. And then further down, we have the island of Martha's Vineyard and the town of Chilmark, which is going to be most of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So one of the people that we want to focus on is one of Bernard Lombard's children or grandchildren, Jonathan Lambert. And Jonathan Lambert is a Puritan settler. He was born in Barnstable. He gets married in 1683. He actually participates in like a British expedition against the French in Quebec. Doesn't like that, doesn't like Barnstable. His wife apparently has some relatives that are actually living on the vineyard. And so he goes and moves to the vineyard. So in 1692, there's a record of Jonathan Lambert, who is the first deaf vineyarder, and he's descended from these men of Kent. So he's probably speaking some variation of that old Kentish sign language, and he settles into a place that is called Lambert's Cove. And Lambert's Cove is on the it's on the west side of Martha's Vineyard, and we'll get into the geography of Martha's Vineyard a little bit more in the future. But he basically buys some property, and it's in a very isolated part of an island that is totally set apart from Barnstable, from the Cape, or from southeastern Massachusetts. It's basically an enclave within an enclave. So what happened in this enclave? Well, Jonathan Lambert starts building a family, and he has 2 of his 7 children are born deaf mute. And if you look at this, so right here I have like a genealogy chart of the different families. So I have Jonathan Lambert, who married Elizabeth Eddy, and you see the darkened shapes on this diagram show which of the offspring were actually born deaf. So he had a deaf son and a deaf daughter, and they were congenitally deaf. But you also have, in another entirely different branch, he has a grandniece, and he has 2 grandnephews and a grandniece that are also born deaf. So what you start having is this sort of, you have this result where in a large family, about 1 out of 4 of the children are being born deaf. Well, if you're familiar with Gregor Mendel and his sort of genetics, this is exactly what would happen if you put together 2 recessive genes, that 1 out of every 4 of the offspring of that would have that recessive gene becoming dominant, and that person would be born with those recessive traits. And this is exactly what you start seeing here. So in the other branch of the family that is not directly related to Jonathan Lambert, those genes must have been recessive. So from a genealogical point of view, what we have to think is that of those Puritans that came over from Kent, that recessive gene for deafness must have run really, really common. So on the vineyard itself, so you've got an isolated enclave within an isolated enclave off of Massachusetts with a very small population. So by the late 1700s, you had about 96% of people who were married to somebody that they were related to already. And so you start having maybe first, second, third cousins. You marry your second cousin, you marry your third cousins. But then you start having the sort of phenomenon of double cousins. So I'm related to my spouse, not just in one way, but 2, maybe 3 different ways. So the other thing that kind of contributed to this is the fact that immigration to the vineyard stopped around 1710. So around 1710, you stopped having any more sort of diversity happening in the gene pool in the vineyard. So let's talk about how the vineyard was structured geographically, because this is kind of important. So you have the east side of the vineyard, which is downwind. So the vineyarders called it Down Island. And that's, it's wooded, it's sandy. There's a fantastic harbor there in Edgartown. People are able to build large ships and get in and out of Edgartown. And so that became a great center of commerce for the whaling trade, for the China trade. They were very prosperous and fairly cosmopolitan. But if you go to the other side, the west side of Martha's Vineyard, then it's an entirely different story. Hang on, sorry. The west side is isolated. It doesn't have good harbors. What you have are beaches with bluffs. And so instead of engaging in the shipping trade or the whaling trade, which is much more prosperous, you've got dories, you're going fishing, um, and it's poorer. The other thing is that the roads on the vineyard, like let's talk about the 1700s and onward, are pretty terrible. And so if you lived in Chilmark, which is, down in the southwest corner, or if you lived, around Lambert's Cove, it would take you a full day on horseback to be able to make your way to Edgartown, which was the main town. So again, you're dealing with more isolation. Then on top of that, you're dealing with sub-isolates where people from one part of Chilmark would kind of look down from on another, population in another part of Chilmark, like, oh, you don't want to run with a Menemsha Creek crowd. You want to kind of keep it to yourself. So you start getting this tremendous sort of isolation, which mirrors the sort of culture that you had before in the Weald in England. So demographically, how does this play out? Well, by the middle of the 19th century, where you have better records, you have 1 in 25 vineyarders is deaf. Now, if you look at the general population, the statistics for then, it's 16 times what it was in the general population, where 1 in about 400 was deaf. So there's a graphic here that kind of illustrates the difference in the in deafness, but it also illustrates the, how much of the population was actually deaf. And people looked at this as typical, or they looked at this as normal. I mean, deafness was just something that just happened. You're not particularly aware of the genetics. So you just kind of think, well, anybody could have deaf children. In fact, some people would think, well, some of the quotes are like, you'd never hardly know when they were deaf and dumb. People up there just got so used to them that they didn't take hardly any notice of them. So it was taken for granted. It was sort of assumed as just a trait that some people had and other people had. So it wasn't looked down upon in any way. For those who were deaf, it was not looked at as a tragedy. And, if you were deaf, you would look at it as an inconvenience, certainly not a serious disability. And, there would be outsiders that would come, like from the press, historians that would come, interview people, and it would shock them. I mean, they would kind of take it as that the deaf people were proud of their condition, and they were shocked by the pride, because deaf people on the mainland certainly didn't have the sort of accommodations that the deaf vineyarders had. So it was looked at very differently. Everybody was fluent in the sign language. All the Up Islanders were fluent by the mid 1800s. It was just assumed that you knew how to sign, so that if you met somebody else from Up Island or from the west side, essentially you would feel like if you started signing to them that they should be able to respond to you. Now, I've lived in Miami. This is the same thing with Spanish and English. Like, people, if you look Latin enough, they'll just assume that you're going to be able to respond to them in Spanish and that you can switch back and forth. So people were truly bilingual, and the expectation was that you were truly bilingual. And a lot of the outsiders that would go to Chilmark or go to that part of the vineyard would kind of feel like, oh, hey, we're at a loss because we can't participate in conversations. So they were the ones who would actually start feeling excluded. But there was no name for this. And I bet you if you asked one of the vineyarders who actually spoke this, who actually used sign language, they probably wouldn't even call it a language. They would call it talking deaf and dumb. And they picked it up. It wasn't taught in school. It was really considered practical knowledge. So it was kind of like something that you would pick up from being around the community or something. So people learned it. They really learned it because if someone in the family was deaf, well, you just picked it up because the entire family would sign. So that makes sense. And otherwise, you would learn it through interactions with your neighbors, with your peers. And a lot of the times where those sort of interactions would happen is if you were running errands, like for instance, here in the general store for the town. So, how did this play out in everyday life? There's a great term that anthropologists use, which is code switching. I grew up bilingual, and trust me, it's not just switching from one language to another, it's switching from one language to an entirely different culture or an entirely different way of seeing things. But this would happen all the time in everyday life in Chilmark. So there's one woman who told this great story about walking into the general store. There's all these guys that are hanging out on the porch, and they're telling this really dirty story. And she walks in, and they just switch from speaking to sign language, and they finished off the story. Punchline was in sign language. Everybody's cracking up, and she has no clue what was said. So it was considered, well, it wasn't just considered a polite thing to do, but it was just like everybody spoke it. So you could kind of switch to that, and you could just kind of, keep going around your business. Another way that the hearing folks would actually use it is you would use a sound like a bell, or you would use some other way of getting somebody's attention, and then you would switch to sign language. So if you're, for instance, you're in a fishing dory, it's loud, you got the wind, you got the waves, you got your motor, whatever, and somebody on shore wants to know, whether you're ready to come in, or, you've got, this is what we use cell phones for now, or this is what we would use walkie-talkies for now. But, in those days, you just had your voice. And sign language allowed hearing people to extend the range of communication much further than their voice would carry. And fishermen in particular, took onto this like nobody's business. If you had a town meeting in Chilmark, it was like unconscionable to have somebody to exclude all the deaf in the meeting. So what you would do is you would get somebody who's a volunteer, or you would choose somebody from the crowd that basically would work as a sign language interpreter for those people that were in the audience that couldn't hear. So if you picture these gentlemen here in this photo of his town meeting, if you picture there's somebody off camera that's signing to them, and they're following the person who's signing, and they're fully aware and fully engaged in real time in the proceedings of the town meeting. So this is, this is also an important factor because, if you were deaf, it also didn't mean in those days that you failed to participate in democracy or you failed to participate in town government. You participated pretty much at all levels. One of the things that came out with a lot of the interviews that Nora Gross did with some of the last islanders who had contact with the deaf islanders on Martha's Vineyard was that they were not defined by their disability. People would say, oh yeah, so and so. Oh right, come to think of it, yeah, they were deaf and dumb. Oh right, oh yeah. That's true. Okay. Just like you would remember that they were married to somebody else, or, what color hair they had, it was the same sort of thing. People were not defined by their disability, which is the opposite, for instance, that would happen, for instance, in Latin culture, where your nickname would be like El Sordo, the deaf guy. So in this case, you were not defined by your disability. So let's fast forward to the late 1800s. And there's a gentleman, Alexander Graham Bell, does a lot of research in audiology and a lot of research in sound. And his wife, Mabel Gardner Hubbard, was actually deaf from the age of 5. So he had a particular personal interest in audiology. And he lived on the vineyard for about 4 years conducting research. And he was trying to figure out, well, what was the cause of all this deafness that happened on the vineyard? And so Alexander Graham Bell, one of the offshoots of the research that he did in audiology was the telephone, which all of us use. It was a core invention, but that was not what he was originally setting out to do. This is kind of like a happy offshoot from the research that he was trying to do. But Alexander Graham Bell, in some ways, he kind of got it wrong, and certainly believed in certain philosophies which are totally unacceptable by 21st century standards. So one of these is eugenics, where if you have any sort of genetic flaw, you shouldn't have children, because essentially what you want to do is you want to create a pure human race without flaws. So he felt that deaf people should not risk having deaf children. He had basically no idea of Gregor Mendel's research or being able to prove the genetics of deafness, but he felt that if you were deaf, you should not have children, or if you were congenitally deaf. Another thing that that's questionable is that he really firmly believed in oralism. So it kind of came from a kind place, where he believed that deaf people should be integrated in society as much as possible. It should be as mainstream as possible. And he felt that deaf children, they should be brought up to speak as best as they could. And even up until very recently, like I have coworkers who are hard of hearing and were brought up oralist. This has been the prevailing attitude in the United States towards people who are hard of hearing and deaf. Learn to speak first, maybe you learn sign language. And the sad thing is that science kind of proves otherwise. If you're deaf and you're raised to speak, your vocabulary is going to be extremely limited. So in that window before age 5, where you start picking up a lot of the rudiments of your language, a deaf child who's taught in the oralist way will probably only have a vocabulary of 75 words. On the other hand, a deaf child who's raised to sign will have a vocabulary of about 1,000 words by age 5. And so the more successful path for this would be to teach a child to sign and then start working on the speech as something optional. Let's talk now in terms of where did this kind of evolve into, what was the legacy of this sign language that you had on Martha's Vineyard? Well, in the Hartford School for the Deaf, the American School for the Deaf in Hartford that was founded by Thomas Gallaudet. What you found people coming from the Vineyard, going to Harvard, using the Martha's Vineyard sign language, and it was kind of mixing in with French sign language. And it became its own sort of language or its own sort of dialect within that school. And that ended up becoming the official roots of American Sign Language. But it wasn't something that was designed top down. It wasn't something that was mapped out by a linguist. It was something that kind of evolved more organically with the students at the school. Now, one of the things that I found when I was doing my research, and one of the things that I really want to talk about, was this sort of bias against languages that can't be written. And this is, for instance, right here, I have a film strip of George Veditz, who and who created a film in 1913, which was called Preservation of Sign Language. And what he was trying to do was use film very early on to capture signs so that his sign language would not be lost, because he's probably very aware of the decline of Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. So what you run into is that those of us who are hearing, we use the written language and we preserve that in writing because it's permanent. But a sign language, unless you record it on film, is much more ephemeral. And this is kind of what became the undoing of Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. The number of people that would actually speak that sign language were declining. So as the gene pool in Martha's Vineyard broadened, the number of people that were born deaf started declining as well. So you went from 1 to 25, probably down to a number that was more like 1 in 400, like the rest of the population. And the last native speaker of the Martha's Vineyard Sign Language passed away in 1957. So here we have an Up Islander, Lynn Thorpe, and she's showing us what the sign is for nice to meet you. But as old as Lynn is, she actually learned the sign from one of the older true Up Islanders who spoke it natively. So she's just kind of repeating stuff from her childhood, something that she probably picked up in the general store or something that she picked up from an older neighbor, and kind of showing us what she's doing in her 80s or 90s now. So this kind of brings me to a point that as an immigrant, is really painful, that a language can die within 2 generations. And you find this a lot in immigrant communities where, for instance, you get immigrants coming to the United States or to a different country, and the grandchildren can, learn the language of the place that they go to, and they can no longer speak to their grandparents directly. They need to have their parents as interpreters. And so it was with the Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. It wasn't recorded in any way. It was much more ephemeral. What you have old islanders giving interviews. There's an oral history. If you're lucky, you can catch video clips of them signing, but there is no one on Martha's Vineyard now who's a native speaker of this. So it's very hard for a linguist to go and compare what the Martha's Vineyard Sign Language was against what ASL is. But let's look at this in a different context. The way the sign language involved in Martha's Vineyard may have been repeated itself in Nicaragua. So there's a new Nicaraguan sign language that evolved starting in the 1980s, when you had a slew of orphans being placed in a couple vocational schools for the deaf and in close proximity. And the language evolved very quickly. It started with essentially a sign alphabet. Then they started using mimicas, or really crude hand gestures like, hey, I'm hungry, I want to eat, and you take your hand, you put it up to your mouth. And then it started evolving into a sort of pidgin language where you're mixing those mimicas with other sort of new gestures. And then you start very quickly evolving all the complexity of a full-blown language, where you start having tense, you start having case, you start having person, like, okay, depending on where you are spatially or how you speak, if I'm speaking about myself, or I'm speaking about somebody else. Or did this happen in the past? Did this happen in the future? Or could this potentially happen in the subjunctive? So we see that sort of evolution in Nicaragua with the sign language. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that in Nicaragua, it happened the fastest because these were adolescents that are stuck together. Adolescents are fearless. Young people don't feel the same attachment to existing norms on language that everybody else does. And, I'm a parent. I have kids that are teenagers and young adults, and I can in my own household see exactly how the language is being evolved or how the limits of language are being tested by my kids. So absolutely, we could in the future start seeing evolutions of sign languages or other new sign languages coming up, that would interest linguists in this. But the most important takeaway that I want to give you guys from tonight before I close is that really the fact that everybody spoke the sign language, the universality of that language allowed it to be used in so many other situations than normal. And the fact that that accommodation was so universal, it kind of proved the social model that the disability is not hearing or lack of hearing. The disability is actually the fact that we've constructed a society that is all about writing. It's all about speaking in ways that exclude people who are deaf, and really, it should get you to think in terms of, how the accommodations that we provide can really change the quality of life for others. So with that note, thank you very much, and let me open it up for questions if we have time.
Thank you very much indeed, Claudia. That was absolutely amazing and incredibly fascinating to learn of all that history and culture. Quick reminder to everybody who's listening, we're having a few technical difficulties, but please bear with us. We're hoping to have those unscrambled. Carrie is with me. Hello, Carrie. Sorry about all the confusion at the beginning. I think you have some questions that have come in for Claudia.
Yeah,
Okay.
No worries. And Claudia, it was amazing. That was a really awesome talk. We learned a lot. So we have a couple questions from chat in the chat box. I see Mark McGuire, sorry. Does this vocabulary refer to spoken vocabulary or written vocabulary or sign language vocabulary? I think he was talking about that part with the children and how many words that they were learning.
Oh, that vocabulary. You know what? I believe it was a vocabulary in general, because if you're being brought up in an oralist society, I mean, I'm thinking of a vocabulary as in terms of how many words do you know? Total. That's the way I'm looking at it. And that's the way I interpreted that statistic. But that's, it's a good question. I mean, I probably should have questioned the research a little bit more.
Yeah, if somebody wanted to get a hold of that research and do a little bit more digging, is there a good resource for that?
100%. Okay, so the place to start, first and foremost, is getting Nora Gross's book on Amazon. It's from 1980, but it is available on Kindle, and I would strongly recommend that. That's
great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed. Again, Claudio, you've been involved with ID24 before, and it's wonderful to have had you back and be part of the team again. For everybody who is tuning in, a reminder that ID24 2020 is brought to you with thanks to supporters, Barclays Access, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intopia, Intuit, WebAble, Adrian Roselli, LLC, InfoAxia, and DQ Systems. Without their help, we really couldn't make this happen. Our next talk will be with you on the hour, all things being equal. So 5 minutes to grab a coffee, and we'll see you back here in 5.